and an interest in history. And it seems to me that the sense that history is either uninteresting or irrelevant is, you can't think about strategy if you think that way about history. If you find history so discontinuous that our situation has nothing to do with the situation in the past, then it's virtually impossible to think about where are we going. And I think part of the reason for the success of this movement is I believe that that is a very widespread sensibility. I think it's partly responsible for the success of post-structuralism, postmodernism. That's their attitude towards history. It doesn't matter. It doesn't help you. And I think that the anarchist movement now has its own version of that. And that is a barrier to thinking about strategy, thinking about organization, and thinking about the role of the working class.
Sam?
Yeah, I think Barbara's point on history is really important. Obviously in the 60s, whether it was black activism or the anti-war movement, it meant that you were thinking about empire and slavery and had a sense of history. But I hope we don't romanticize the 60s. The fact about the 60s is we were also defeated. That, there was a moment that was, exciting, and all kinds of things were positive that we can learn from and should learn from. But capital responds. Capital is not just sitting there. The question was, when capital responded, we didn't have the capacity to sustain what we have and go beyond it. And one of the things we have to think about was, what does it mean to actually have the kind of capacity that you can keep moving forward when that happens?
Michael, would you like to say something?
No. Just,
Wonderful example.
I
Let us have a second round quickly of questions.
changed my mind.
Ah, okay.
Have 20 minutes. Because no.
Oh, okay. So a second round, and we'll start from this end this time. Yes, sir.
My name's Jose. Also write a lot under the name Joaquin Bustelo. I just want to make a comment, which is I think it's important to look at Occupy not as political strategic phenomenon, but as a social phenomenon. All my political life I've been hearing people talk about and criticize identity politics, black identity politics, Latino identity politics, women identity politics. Never occurred to anybody to criticize working class identity politics or worker identity politics, because workers did not have any kind of collective identity. I think the most significant thing about Occupy was the slogan, "We are the 99%," and however primitive a level, the re-emergence of a consciousness of social class in the United States. I think that was the single most important thing, and I think it points to a future where the class struggle as such, by name, will return to this country.
Alan.
My name's Alan Ruff. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. I just want to make an observation because I was in the heart of that historic mobilization in Madison. When it gets to the point where there's 250,000 people at the Capitol in Madison, and the Democratic Party stalwarts and the trade union leadership gets up and says, "Go home."
Yeah, what do you think?
Go home and get into the recall. One of the Fab 14 legislators that went to Illinois got up on the rostrum and said, "This is our last mass protest." Speaks to the fact that these masses of people in trade unions and outside of the trade unions had no place to go because there was no left organization, no left pole to counter that demobilization. And we're feeling it to this very week, when just now the state of Wisconsin legislature, dominated by these bastard Republicans, with the Democrats not knowing what to do, universalized the voucher system, the destruction of public education in Wisconsin. And none of the trade union folks, except for a few teachers, and certainly none of the Democrats at the time, that was off the radar. So again, speaking to the need for this organization and, you know, with a strategic outlook. I just wanted to bring that here because people, you know, a lot of my comrades in Wisconsin are heartsick at this point.
I have a couple. My name's Aaron Amaral. I have a couple questions for Sam and for Michael. I work in the public sector trade union. I work for DC 37 as an attorney. My activist work over the period of Occupy was primarily through the kind of labor outreach committee and a variety of sort of labor organizations that were relating in a variety of ways to the occupation. And so my question, Sam, is I just wanted to give you an opportunity in terms of sort of the question of intermediate forms. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak about the Toronto Workers' Assembly, because part of this issue that we've been facing in the aftermath of Occupy is an attempt to sort of consolidate what clearly exists now, which is a new and emerging network of left labor activists, not just in the trade unions, but amongst a group of people who are doing organizing amongst low-wage workers, immigrant workers, etc. And it's quite exciting, but it also represents challenges. So I'd be interested to hear about that. And my question to Michael is to ask you some questions, to say something about Syriza in the last 10 months, and specifically the question of the position on the teachers' strike, which or the possible teachers' strike, where Syriza took very problematic positions in demobilizing the teachers. It also seems to have been moving generally to the right in terms of a move away from the call for government of the left and having much more kind of ambivalent language around the questions of repaying debt. And so I'd be interested to hear your response to that.
Yasmin, and then we'll go to some responses. I'll try to come back to you if I can.
My question is for Michael. You said in your talk that Syriza participated in these initial days of protest without the party banner, and Aaron has mentioned that the masses on these streets seem to be ambivalent, and which is something that we observe in Turkey and Greece. These seem to be young people who grew up in mostly apolitical after-military coup times. Is there a reason for the absence of the party banner? Do these people, is it strategically important for Syriza or for what's going on in Turkey right now, for parties not to expose themselves as such, but rather as activists and move from there?
Okay, we'll have some responses, and I'll try to come back to everyone. Michael and Sam had questions directed specifically at them, so I think let's start with Michael, and then Sam, and then if Charlie and Barbara want to add something they can.
Respond to the last question. Greek political parties, especially the established parties, but also the left-wing parties, they've been very patronizing towards the movement. They wanted to control them or replicate them or for the longest time. And the Occupy movement sensed this and turned against the formal representative institutions such as unions. They were explicitly against, and against political parties in general. So Syriza sensed this, and even held among the youth, held some educational sessions to say, okay, we're not going to do what the old left was doing. We are there to learn. This is how we talk, blah, blah, blah. They did that. You have to keep in mind that the Syntagma Square Occupy movement lasted for 45 days before the police crashed it and in sort of a big disaster and all that. So that was the reason that, kind of Syriza did. Now, the other question is, it's more interesting. I've outlined the strategy of Syriza, but that doesn't mean that Syriza is one thing. And old habits die hard. And the people of Syriza who are active in the so-called the traditional movement, in other words, the labor movement, are of the old guard. The old guard, sort of a more CPers, more like PASOK, more somewhere between a Greek version, the second and third international. So they're afraid of that movement. The other Syriza that gives the dynamic, which is in the new movements, solidarity to the immigrants, civil rights, what have you, it's quite different culture, okay? Now, what happened with the student, with the teachers movement? In the teachers movement, there was a massive support for the strike, but after the government preventatively had introduced back to work legislation. So the leaders, the Syriza people in the trade union movement interpreted that vote that being a vote which is safe. Therefore, they didn't want to confront the government and go into disobedience and maybe risk to end up in prisons, massively and all that kind of stuff, which was a mistake. Now that would lead me to going to the right, shift to the right of immediately, the one day after, there was a central committee and Tsipras, the leader of the party, spoke and explicitly, he was very critical of that decision made. It was a mistake, and it was a mistake because, once again, all the habits die hard. Let's be very clear about that. And one of his aides, a colleague, an economist, hours after this decision was made, by the way, even if the Syriza people there had voted to go ahead with the strike and confront the back to work legislation, they would have had the majority, okay? Just keep that in mind, we can make a difference. But at least Syriza wouldn't have contributed to the demoralization of the trade unions. Let's face it. And also, it seems to me that Syriza lost an opportunity to pick up that sparkle and move forward, okay? Now, one of the aides of Tsipras, he was very critical of that publicly, in social media immediately. So, class struggle takes place not just out there, or in the abstract, or in the book, but within our organizations. Just keep that in mind, okay? Now, the move to the right, having said all this, one has to be very honest. And this is a result of the propaganda, and one has to be very careful because the establishment has two lines. One, that Syriza is a terrorist organization, and the other, the very same source says Syriza is shifting to the right, sort of wing at the internal sectarianism of the coalition of Syriza. But again, having said this, parliamentarism, it's a very contagious thing, okay? And we do know that. Syriza had about 10 MPs, it now has 71. A lot of energy went there, a lot of expertise went there, and this legislation, the other legislation, downstairs, tomorrow we're having a session with a Greek MP. I used to run into her more in a demonstration. I haven't seen her for 10 minutes. No, but he has been to demonstrations, but he has been up to there for these workers and this occupation and all that kind of stuff. But we don't meet because we grew too fast, and that creates some kind of a sort of a conservatism or sort of the image of we're standing, and also we have to understand what radicalism is all about. And I don't think Syriza knows, or Syriza memberships, or even part of the leadership, what it means to be a radical left in terms of Syriza. I dare to say this, and I've said that to them. They don't understand the strategy, what brought us here. Okay, so they are very either technocratic or too parliamentarianist, but the leader and the leadership, the current leadership, the extent you can believe me, it has a radical orientation, still the same and still strong. Okay, I'm in a position to say
We're
that.
over time, but Sam, I think it's important that Sam be allowed to say something about the Toronto Workers' Assembly. So if people will just have some patience and bear with us, just give them a few minutes.
Okay, at a completely different level than what's going on in Greece. The basic point of the assembly was to engage activists in the discussion of what they're doing and the fact that whatever they were doing simply didn't match what we were up against, and that this was absolutely clear with the crisis. And whether, therefore, we needed a new layer of politics, not coalitions, but a new layer of politics where people would keep being active but engage in a new layer of politics. So let me just highlight 4 particular problems we had. One was that there was a lack of labor struggles going on, and it meant that we didn't actually have spaces in which we could intervene. We depended on those struggles. Now, from that perspective, if there was an assembly in Wisconsin, it would have been a different ballgame. I mean, it really raises that question. As labor struggles did increase recently, we've actually been able to build more of a labor base. A second problem, which was quite serious, was we want to do a lot of internal education. But to do internal education, you have to have a consensus on what you're doing education with. And we were tiptoeing around our differences. And I think that was a mistake, because a lot of the people who were barriers to getting into discussions of class, for example, faded away anyway. So I think that was a mistake. Another problem we had was the impatience of movements. A number of movements agreed that what they were doing just couldn't match what they're facing and wanted to join something larger. But their idea of building was, we'll wait for 6 months, and if this really does something for us, great, and if it doesn't, we're going to go back to what we're doing. And we couldn't actually deliver in 6 months. That was a contradiction for us. That was another problem. Another problem was generational capacities. There's just a missing generation of capacities, and I'm not talking about the occupied people so much as people can actually talk to workers. And this was a major problem, and I'm a little bit optimistic about that. There's been a lot of good young people who tend to be anarcho-syndicalists, wobblies, who've actually been very open to doing this and engaging the working class. I think that was another problem. And I just want to conclude with, the Wisconsin problem wasn't just that there was nothing about what to do. Even in the midst of the Wisconsin struggle, even at its height, the language from the labor leaders who were sympathetic to the struggle was about the middle class.
That's right.
And that's why I think we shouldn't exaggerate what Occupy achieved. And the middle class is code for 2 things. I mean, one is for excluding blacks, basically. It's code for that. And then it's a particular notion of capitalism isn't a relationship around property and class, but it's kind of like we just happen to be in the middle, and maybe we can move up.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming.